if you don't have a God in your life that you have a personal, felt relationship with, not just an intellectual idea or an abstract principle, that's going to be a very tough sell.
In today's video, gents, I want to introduce you to Dr. Orion over at Psychax, one of my favorite YouTubers.
When we choose to go against our program, there's a part of us that can rise above the inertia and the momentum and the tendency of all of our past choices and say, no, I want something different.
And the reason being, he's giving practical, solid advice on how men can improve their lives.
Our ability to overcome our own deterministic nature, on some level, the more divine we become, the more powerful we become.
So be warned, gents, watching today's video could transform your life for the better. You ready? Let's do it.
So if you weren't doing what you're doing now, let's say you had to totally switch careers, what would you do?
I want to really live as many different lives as possible. And it's a shame that I only get to experience life as Orion just this once.
That you know of?
Well, yeah, I actually believe in reincarnation, but I don't know if I'm going to come back as Orion per se. I think this is going to be my first and only time in this rodeo. But maybe I will get a chance to live a totally different life, but I might not have any recollection of it. I certainly don't have any recollection of my previous lives. But, oh man, there's so many things I wish I could do. There was a time when I was either going to go to acting school or the Naval Academy in Annapolis, which is pretty much the widest possible divergence of options you can imagine, like being a theater actor in New York City and being a naval officer. Ultimately, I decided to go.
I've known quite a few naval officers that were very good at acting like they were working. So I'm just, no, the Navy totally, it's like, I love the Navy, man. Those guys got us everywhere. Some of my best friends, former squids, and great guys. They definitely, the, counterpoint to, with the Marine Corps. But no, that would have been, so the Annapolis was because of just simply your relationship with Pendleton and family?
Because of my godfather. Yes, my godfather, as I was saying, was a captain in the Navy. He was the chief medical officer in Camp Pendleton, the largest Marine Corps base in the country, as you know. And I spent many weekends of my youth on the base with him, and I got initiated into military culture, and I found it to be just so fascinating as a young man. All the ribbons and the swords and the medals and the honor and the discipline. I found it to be very romantic because I did have some distance from it because I wasn't actually enlisted, and my godfather was a high-ranking officer, so you get a lot of the good things in that kind of position and fewer of the bad things. So he encouraged me to kind of follow in his footsteps, and I strongly considered it, but ultimately I felt like I was being pulled in a different direction.
In the military, there's a lot of performative masculinity, or at least, with the swords, with the uniforms, with the ribbons, but it works. And I think that no one even actually, one of the reasons even the world loves it is because there's a deeper, true masculinity behind it. The men and women in the military, in a sense, they have a spine. And they have, as you said in one of your videos, testicles.
Sure, yeah, balls in a spine. They certainly have to put it on the line if they're combat military, for sure. It's like there's no greater wager than a person is willing to make than to put his or her own life on the line, generally for the sake of others. If not in the abstract way of the folks back home, but at least the comrades in arms of your battalion or your platoon or what have you. And that's no small thing. I think that part of why a lot of that performative masculinity in the military works is it is still largely based on merit and desert. Like there are ribbons that are basically participatory ribbons. There's like the Naval Expeditionary ribbon, and you went to the Gulf, you get the medal, but those are very low-ranking ribbons. They're near the bottom of a person's chest. Everything near the top has to do with actually doing something extraordinary. And I believe that we're kind of moving away from a merit-based culture in so many different ways. And I think people are hungry, not just for recognition, but for appropriate and accurate recognition of what good they're able to accomplish. And a lot of people, I think men in particular, are despairing of realizing that good inside of themselves because they don't think that it's going to matter. Like anybody is going to see it, anyone's going to acknowledge it, and it's not going to make a difference anyway. I don't know if that's necessarily true. And I think at the highest levels, you certainly don't do the good just because it's recognized. But I do think at the lower levels, that might be important and necessary. It's certainly what got me, enamored with the military as a young man. I think you outgrow the external validation, but I do think the external validation has its place, especially among younger men. It's very difficult to die on a hill if no one will remember your name and it's not going to make much of a difference anyway.
I'm sure that you've read Viktor Frankl's classic "Man in
Of
the
course.
Search for Meaning," and in that he talked about like how do you find meaning in a sense when everybody in this camp could be executed and killed? Like, where is the meaning in actually having dignity today and to meet? So, do you feel that like even if nobody sees your actions, if you're being a good man, if you're taking the steps you need to, that there's still value there?
Absolutely.
But I do think that might require some relationship to a higher power.
I think if you don't have that, if you don't have a God in your life that you have a personal, felt relationship with, not just an intellectual idea or an abstract principle, that's going to be a very tough sell. Because from a very practical, materialistic standpoint, people can be just wiped out and their existence can be made as if nothing. If there's not some permanent record, if there's not some frame of reference that sees all and preserves all and understands everything, it's going to be very difficult to have courage in your own private heart of hearts that practically will make no real difference in the world. So I do think that Victor was a religious man. And I think that it's no secret and no coincidence that religiosity and the military often go hand in hand. Like there's a very strong Christian component to the Marines that I found when I was on that base.
Yeah, there definitely is for a lot of guys that connection, especially when you're faced with your own mortality and you're asking questions that the average person maybe doesn't ask. Uh, I always like to think, and again, this is sometimes you do the right thing when nobody's looking. I always like to think that, especially if it's engaging with somebody I don't know very well, or that somehow it's going to come back. And maybe this is wishful thinking, but what would you say to that theory? Maybe the butterfly effect, where that small action can set forth a chain of reactions, which could either lead back to you or lead back to a descendant or something like that.
Yeah, it's pretty deep, man. I mean, I think that's what merit or karma is on a deep level, which is really interesting. I made an episode about this a long time ago on my first YouTube channel. Maybe I should bring it back on Psychax. I went into a spiritual examination of causality because on some level, you can perceive of the universe as being completely deterministic. Like if you had perfect understanding of the laws of physics and you knew where all the particles were, on some level, you should be able to predict more or less where everything is going to be further down the line. Now, quantum mechanics kind of fucks that up to some certain extent, but I think you understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So the question is sort of like, how do people improve? Because I think that like on some level, people kind of get what they've always gotten because they haven't changed. Like, and how do you initiate a real change based on the person that you currently are? That maybe we have something inside of us called free will. And maybe that's like a spark of divinity. One of the traditional aspects of divinity is its ability to perform miracles. Okay. It's like, it's miraculous that Jesus could walk on water or multiply the loaves, etc., which seem to go against the laws of deterministic nature. But that's what we do when we choose to do something different, when we choose to go against our programming, when we choose to go against our genetic or familial legacies, when we choose to go against our emotional habits or our addictions. There's a part of us that can rise above the inertia and the momentum and the tendency of all of our past choices and say, no, I want something different. And I think that that's actually miraculous, because if we truly were just conglomerations of atoms with nothing inside of us, that there was no free will, that everything was deterministic, I don't see how we couldn't just continue on the trajectories that we currently, are on, until I guess some other random body caroms into us and we're pushed into a different direction. But I do think that people can make choices that don't require them to be bumped into by external forces. That choice can come from within them. And I think that is our ability to overcome our own deterministic nature. And the more we practice that, on some level, the more divine we become, the more powerful we become. I think will and power are very closely related to one another. And I think that's how some of the 20th century's greatest figures have overcome, some like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, have overcome enormous challenges through the strength of their own will. I think that that's how we overcome our habits, our inertia, our environments. We cultivate the strength of will. And just like any other muscle, the more that we use it, the stronger that it gets.
Got a few easy questions for you. These were
Okay.
asked of my the guy. I reached out to some of the guys in my circles, and one of the first questions that a couple guys asked was, what watch does Orion wear in his videos? They can't identify it, and they're very curious. And
Really?
yeah,
Okay. I do have a watch that I tend to wear. It's a Burberry watch. I don't think it's anything all that special, but I liked the look of it.
there we go.
Um,
Yeah,
my
simple,
father
clean,
bought it for me
classic.
for my birthday, I think right around the time when I graduated with my doctorate. We talked about having the right costume, which he totally understood.
Yeah.
He's worked in the finance industry for all of his career, and he knows that he's got to show up in the smart Italian suits, and he needs to have his fashion in such a way to communicate fiduciary responsibility and success, and that's part of his job. And so we figured that there has to be some kind of accessory or accoutrement that could communicate, let's say, trustworthiness or prestige from a psychological perspective. And this is what we settled on.
There's a whole study actually. They showed that actually men that wear watches, and I believe I don't know if it applied to women as well, but they actually do show up on time more often. It's just it's a simple thing. They have it time to be able to check. So now you brought up clothing, and so that's going to lead to the next question. How do you normally dress? And do you actually? I've seen you in jackets. I've seen you usually in collared shirts. I mean, you dress appropriately. It seems like for your audience, also very approachable. Do you think through your clothing and the message it's sending?
Yeah, I could definitely use your help in that capacity, Antonio. I'm sure you know so much more about this than I do. I'm starting to become more cognizant and intentional about my dress, especially as I'm making more and more media appearances. Like a few months ago, I went out and bought 3 new suits. I only had one suit, and I think it was a suit that I bought for a wedding several years ago, but it was getting a little obvious that I kept wearing the same like electric blue suit on all of my media appearances, and people were starting to mention that. So it made me a little self-conscious. It's it's interesting. You could go kind of the actual suit and tie route as a psychologist, or you could go a little, like academic and with sweaters or blazers with suede patches on the elbows. I also tend to be a little edgier than a lot of psychologists. I swear I tackle more sensitive issues than some of my colleagues. And so I, I think I want to present myself as a little bit more, little less straight laced and conservative than some of the more famous psychologists that present themselves to the public. But it's a work in progress. Like I definitely could use more game with respect to my fashion, which is ironic because I definitely tell men that it's one of the easiest things that they can improve.
Well, if we're ever near each other, just let me know, and I'll take you out. We'll go. I find it fun, but my background, I did study psychology and biology, a mix of them. In my undergrad, it was called Origins of Behavior, and I just loved, and to this day, I still seek out information and studies. About maybe 15 years ago, they opened up a new field at Northwestern University. They were leading the charge there, called enclothed cognition, how it affects us personally. I found was even more interesting. The fact that you're working from home, and if you haven't showered and if you're on a video, nobody can smell you. But your confidence, and people perceive your confidence, and they've shown this again and again, is actually lower for people. Even though you can have thrown your head into the, sink, got the hair all looking good, you can be in a nice suit, but if you haven't showered or you believe you stink. Uh, little things like that I find, wearing the color red, another small thing, even if it's a small amount, whenever people are watching a video. They'll watch the same presentation, but if there's a bit of color red that the wearers he has on, he comes off as more confident again and again. So it's like little things like this. I love bringing this to the forefront so that I always look at the guys that are watching my videos as, they really don't care that much about style. And I don't think they should. They should focus on their expertise. But I don't ever want it to shoot them to mess things up or to have missed an opportunity because they could have just made a small tweak here on their image. And that's the kind of stuff that I find fun. But
Oh, I definitely see that. I made a commitment to myself that even throughout all of the shutdowns, that I would always dress as if I were seeing the person in my office. Like I was never just wearing pajamas from the waist down, which I know a lot of folks were doing during the Zoom era. I felt like I owed it to myself, and it also created sort of it's like putting on my uniform before going out on the field. It was a way of mentally preparing that I was entering into a specific role, and I could then take off that role when I was done having my consultations. It was sort of like a ritual that cognitively separated that part of my day from the rest of the day. So it was easier for me to kind of like role switch afterwards, so I didn't have to continue to be a therapist in my social life.
I want to share this really quick because I think you'd find this interesting, and I will definitely get your. So this is the set of fragrances that I developed, and what separates these, you may notice the core values there: honor, courage, and commitment. They are the same core values of the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps. But I found it interesting how I would wear certain fragrances and feel a certain way. And what I was accident, it was just, I was conditioning myself to this, and I didn't even know I was doing this classical conditioning. And in the same way, if you think about like when the World Trade Centers fell, I was just in New York with my daughters, and we went to the museum. And whenever they would be around the smell, because it was a very unique smell. If you ever go to the museum, highly recommend it. But it was so crazy when everything fell together. It molded into a composite material that just had a unique but smell. And the people that would be around this months later, years later, would freak out. They had no idea this smell had embedded itself and it forced the reaction of flight in these people. That's a bad negative example there. But on the flip side, could you condition yourself if you were wearing a fragrance to feel more honorable, more courageous, more committed to your goals? And that's actually what we did what we did with our fragrances is we actually have a course, a conditioning course that you associate being honorable. Every time you wear the fragrance, you envision and you go through a little exercise of remembering a time you were honorable, thinking of a time you were honorable, taking one honorable step to prove that you were honorable. And this can be something small, like simply sending a message to somebody that you had a disagreement with, and just saying, "Hey, I still care about you." That text right there, because you're a man of honor. You're a man that follows through. You've got your rules and your commitments. But yeah, I've been having fun with this project because I feel the fragrance industry is so big, but everything's about six-pack abs or looking sexy. And yeah, that side project is just something I was having fun with.
That's actually really interesting on a number of levels. So first of all, you have on some level the placebo effect. Like if you were to put the same fragrance in a bottle that said courage and another one that said cowardice, I imagine that everyone is going to feel better spraying the one that comes from the first bottle on them. But what you're actually doing is going one step further and advocating for some kind of classical conditioning. Whereas when a person actually does one of those things, when he behaves in a committed fashion or an honorable fashion, he should then take that fragrance and spray it on him, which is a way of like deeply associating that action with that substance, with that fragrance. Over enough time, it's just like Pavlov and the dog who,
Exactly.
Trained the dog to salivate with
Yeah,
the
and
pill.
I'm really clear in the course. Actually, we're using operant conditioning. This is, straight stuff here. And what's interesting, even though the placebo effect, what I find interesting about it is it gets kind of a negative rap, but it's very effective and it
Oh, yeah.
actually does work. And
and hopefully you're
but
charging a lot because more expensive placebos are more effective than less expensive placebos.
yes, that's actually been part of the way I do this is like I have to take money because you won't actually go through you won't actually do the training unless you pay for it. I've given these things away for free, and I know when I do, people don't go through and the training and they don't use it in that way.
Yeah, they
And
don't value it as much. It's too bad. But I remember I would get all kinds of flakiness when I ran my nonprofit education organization or I worked for community mental health centers. Now, when I charge, top dollar, people don't miss appointments. They're taking notes. They implement what the suggestions that I give them, even if they don't necessarily agree with them. They're going to feel like a schmuck if they pay me all this money and they don't at least try it. So it's actually in their best interests in terms of their motivation and commitment to put some money on the felt because we know how people are without that.
yeah, and it's tough to have because everyone, yeah, it's tough to have this conversation, especially when somebody wants a discount, somebody wants it at a lower price, and you've got to hold the line because you know that they're just not going to complete it. They're not. I used to even give scholarships away to some of my style programs and stuff, and I just found that people wouldn't complete them. So I'm like, I price them at a point that I don't think it's. I think if you saved up, you could get it. You could get this.
Well, let's also go back to your values. This is really cool because I'm not so great on, let's say, fashion. I don't think I'm a total klutz, but obviously there's still much that I have to learn. But I am somewhat conversant in, like, let's say, personal branding. And there's a number of things that I've done that I think are fairly unusual. Like, I've never heard of anybody else do these things. Like, for example, I have my own personal flag. I love flags. I'm a vexillologist. I've been obsessed with flags since I was a young boy. And so I decided to create a flag that I have up in my office. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but it symbolizes all the colors, and the stars symbolize certain things. There are 3 stars in it, just like the 3 stars in Orion's belt, and they represent my core values, which are courage, wisdom, and justice. So I think it's really important for people to clarify who they really want to be, because we can't be everything. People often say that, it costs nothing to be kind. I'm sure you've heard that before.
Yes.
It's not true. You do have, certainly being kind is more expensive than being unkind. It requires more forbearance. It requires patience. It requires more expenditure to resist certain impulses that may arise in you. And if you invest in the virtue of kindness, it's very difficult to do that and also necessarily invest in, let's say, the virtue of justice. Oftentimes, those two things are at odds with one another. So it's not possible to be like virtuous in all of the virtues. You kind of have to pick and choose because ultimately they do tend to diverge and take people to different places. Like the person whose life is about being courageous may be end up in a very different place than the person who's devoted to being wise. So I think that a person can have 2 or 3 real core values that they can invest in, and to do so intentionally. I made an episode about this a long time ago, but it's one of my first ones, so very few people have watched it. And it's called The Value of Values, where I talk about the real function of values. It's almost like it's the special lens that you can put up to your eye to clarify your path forward. Without values, it can seem like there's literally hundreds of different ways that you can go. There's hundreds of different pathways in life. Which one to take? What should I do? Should I go here, go there, etc.? But not all of those paths have the same value valence, as it were. So if you're presented with 100 different options and you want to build courage in your life, then you can take the lens of courage and put it up to your mind's eye, and suddenly 99% of those pathways are going to disappear because most of those pathways are not courageous pathways. there's probably only one or two choices that you have in front of you that are very clearly the most courageous things to do. And if you want to grow courage, you have to walk on that path. There's no other way to do it. The only way to build a muscle is to use it. The only way to cultivate a virtue is to perform it. And we perform it by choosing the courageous or the wise or the prudent or the temperate or the kind action. But that definitely comes at a cost. But it's worth it. But let's not pretend that it's free and everyone should just be effortlessly virtuous. That's not going to help people. That's like saying you should just be muscular.
Speaking of muscles, I do have a question for you. I've never seen you talk about fitness. How do you stay healthy? What do you have? What do you do?
Yeah, I'm still working on that. So I've been a long distance runner for several years. So generally, I run a 5K every day, and I have been doing HIIT classes a couple of times a week. Though I'm taking a new path as of late, and I have a coach who's built a weightlifting routine for me. So now I'm lifting weights 4 days a week in addition to the cardio. So I don't think I'm the fittest guy in the world. That's why I don't often talk about it. There's clearly guys who have bigger muscles and six-pack abs and have this really dialed in, but I certainly don't ignore it. So I feel like I'm in good, healthy shape for my age, and I want to give more and more attention to that in the months and years ahead.
Did you ever play any sports when you were younger?
Yeah, when I was younger, I played soccer up until the point where it started to become really competitive, and then I just couldn't keep up really. Partly, I think that's because I was always the young kid in my grade. I was kind of skipped ahead.
Yeah.
And that didn't matter as much before puberty, but afterwards, having a year or two on me, it was very hard to keep up with boys who were 2 years older than me. Also, I just was falling into other pursuits, so I wasn't willing to give the sport the commitment that it deserved at that point. But I played soccer. I did some martial arts. I was the worst competitive downhill skier on my ski team for a couple of years. So I was somewhat athletic, but certainly nothing to be proud of.
You can ski better than me because it's funny. It's one of those
Maybe.
things that
I don't know. I finished dead last in pretty much every competition I ever entered.
yeah, I've tried it once, cross country, and that, that should be easy, but no, I still crashed. And I'm like, my kids love it. We have actually a nice little ski hill here in Wisconsin that right next to our house that makes it easy. But I look at it as one of those things I don't want the injuries.
And that's part of why. It's like I was a fearless child on the slopes, but then something happened right around the time I joined the team when I realized how badly people could get hurt, and like I got seized by the fear. And after that, I was too conservative to be a competitive skier. I was breaking around the turns, and my coach was like, "What are you doing? You got to go." And I was like, "That's a little scary, coach. Come on, man. I could hurt myself." So it didn't work out.
So you're the safe skier.
I was the safe skier. And if you want to win, you can't be the safe skier.
I've got a program that I run. It's called Health, Wealth, Purpose. And the health and the wealth, that's all pretty self-explanatory. But the purpose, I didn't see anything out there. So I got really excited because over the years, I've worked on defining my purpose. It was something that I grew up with. I felt purpose that was pushed on me I grew up Catholic. But after I left the religion, it was just something that I was kind of lost for a while. The Marine Corps did a great job, I think, of giving that back to me and of being around a lot of mentors that talked about having something that you stood for. Throughout life, that has been something that has just helped so many times, especially in dark times, going through bankruptcies, dealing with failures in business, getting fired, that kind of stuff, knowing that, that doesn't define me. But what I found is there's a lot of men, and you've talked about this in your videos, that especially younger men that don't have any direction of purpose, and even some older guys, and this is what it can get really bad when they're rudderless. So I'm having a conversation with a man, and it didn't seem like, I realized like he's just having trouble with purpose, motivation, a little bit of back. And this guy tried, he's 36 years old, had left his country of origin when he was 16, bad family. 20 years, this guy had gone every, seems like 2 years. He had like 10 jobs over 20 years. He's put in effort. He's tried, but he's just reached this point where he's just like, he almost wants to give up. And I was having this conversation with him, and I didn't really know what more to tell somebody like this except, don't give up, keep going. And that it's, I was trying to encourage him, about to meet the struggle. And that is the win, that you are a success when you choose to go out there and fight the good fight. Um, do you ever talk with people like this? And what advice would you maybe give these men that are having trouble with the struggle of life because they've done the work and they're trying to do everything right, but they're just not getting the results.
Yeah, I talk to people on that issue very often, and it's something that I've had to struggle with personally for years when I was a younger man. So there's kind of two parts to this. First, let's talk about the rudderless young men, and then we'll talk about this particular example where he feels like he's tried everything and he's feeling hopeless. So I think it is very important to have an overarching purpose to your life. But one of the mistakes that I made as a young man is I tried to figure out what that purpose was alone in my room. And I spent many, many months ruminating and spinning my wheels. What life do I want to lead? Who do I want to be? Playing chess 50 moves out before I even made my opener. And that was a lot of wasted time because even when I came to some sort of tentative conclusions, as soon as I stepped into the world and tried to enact them, the world was like, nope. And my entire 50 move chess game was completely invalidated from the very first move from my opponent. So, what I often advise folks to do is that if they're feeling lost, if they're feeling directionless, to enter into a period of, let's say, experimentation, exploration. Like, think of life as a buffet. Try to have, in a foreign country where you don't recognize any of the food, try to have as little contempt prior to investigation as possible. Just because it looks kind of funky doesn't mean it's not going to taste delicious. Try to put a little of everything on your plate. And then the only way you're going to know what actually works for you, what you like, is by putting it inside of you. You have to taste it, you have to enact it. And you'll know right away whether something tastes good or you're never going to put that in your mouth again, right? And so to kind of explore and experiment so that you know where to go back for seconds on your next round at the buffet cart. So I think it's important to find your purpose by exploring how you feel as a consequence of moving through life. I don't think it's an abstract thing that you can decide. Like, for example, my life has turned out to be very, very different from what I thought it was going to be and what I intended it to be when I was a young man. It's on in many ways, so much better than I could have hoped for, but it's not what I thought it was going to be. And there was sort of a grieving period where I gave up on the dreams of my youth, the life that I thought I wanted for myself, to begin to embrace more fully the life that the world had in store for me, and to have some sort of faith that maybe there is some goodness and some purpose to the way that this is turning out. Even though for a while during that transition, it just felt like I was failing. It just felt like I was losing because I was comparing my current progress to what I had arbitrarily decided my life was going to be when I was 20 years old, instead of like accepting the way my life was heading and saying, well, what good might be on this path? Is there anything here that I can really get behind? Is there anything here that can nourish me and enliven me? And there were some things, and there was a lot of dross as well. So the work from there is to kind of like be a gardener and to kind of prune the things that don't really matter and are drudgery and uninspiring, and to continue to cultivate and nurture the things that give you fulfillment and curiosity and purpose, satisfaction, etc. So that's my first advice is to not think about it too much.
Now,
That's it.
the second part is, this guy, and as you pointed out, that there is a second part here with him struggling for 20 years, 10 different jobs. Um, he's doing the work. He's just not getting the results. And he even felt a little bit more detail on this guy. Had he came from a tough family situation, so he didn't finish his, he quit school when he was 14 or 15. He did have a bit of, it looked like, even a little bit of, I'd say, a learning disability, in the way that he spoke and presented. So there were these things that he could blame, and he could say that he's being held. And I think in some ways he does blame that. But you can see that this guy is putting in, like he's been fighting. He's out there trying to make things. He's not giving up, but it's getting harder to not give up.
20 years is a long time. 20 years is a long time. So I can understand why he might be feeling hopeless. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out why you had to struggle the way that you did. I had a pretty rough childhood in many respects, and my adolescence and young adulthood was particularly difficult. And but now, 20 years later, that has been that time in my life has been a source of great I don't know what to call it. It's like I don't want to call it a gold mine, but it's like a source of a lot of meaning and value that I can provide to others. A lot of the reason why I think my content resonates with people is I'm not just saying the literature says this and this is what I read in a textbook. It's like I've been depressed. I've had panic attacks. I've been heartbroken. I've been broke. It's like and I'm not those things anymore. I haven't been depressed in a long time. I haven't had a panic attack in years. I'm making great money. I have satisfying relationships. So it's like I've been in the trenches where a lot of people are and I found a way out. It's not necessarily the way out for everybody, but I know at least it works because it got me out and it might work for you or for somebody else, right? Now, if somebody, or even if I built a time machine and went back to my 20-year-old self and said, Orion, it's really great that you're depressed because 20 years from now, you're going to be able to help people get out of depression. I probably would punch me in the face. You know what I'm saying? It's like, that's not the time to share that perspective because I would be suffering and in the midst of my pain at the time. So I don't want to potentially invalidate this guy and say, hey, one day these struggles might be a source of great value for you and others. But it could very well be true. Hope is a really tough thing. I do think that sometimes sometimes you can put it down for a while. That doesn't necessarily, I don't think that's the same thing as giving up entirely. I do think that we should rest before we quit. And if this guy's feeling really tired and exhausted, like existentially, then maybe he can take a rest from striving towards success for a bit. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to give up on the goal entirely, but maybe trying to push it through right now is not the right moment. There are moments in life. You talked about going bankrupt. I've lost everything a few times in my life and built it back up again. Um, you know, it's not, there are certain, it's just like launching a ship. You go at the flood, you go at the high tide, you don't go at the ebb. So there's a certain level of discipline that requires us to act in spite of conditions, but we can't pretend that we're so omnipotent that we should be able to succeed despite everything that we're dealing with at the present moment. Like some conditions and circumstances are far more propitious for success than others. And sometimes it's just waiting for that right moment. And waiting can be very, very difficult. But if I were in that situation, I would probably say, take a break. And, you know, I don't think that necessarily means that all of the efforts that he's done up until that point are meaningless. Sometimes things have this magical way of like making sense in a Slumdog Millionaire kind of a way, where all of your random experiences actually have prepared you for this one moment that you didn't even know or think that you could possibly confront.
I like that analogy. And what makes that movie so great, yeah, are those unique experiences that he thought maybe were, he'd rather not have had or were throwaway in some people's, but they come to that one point. Just
Yeah, there's this great line in William Golding's Free Fall, and this is how the scar becomes a star. And I think about that a lot because I think my points of greatest value to others are precisely the sources of my greatest sufferings in the past. That's actually a value, helping people get out of suffering. That's a real thing. That's very different than like, tuning their car or, helping them make more ad revenue on their marketing proposals. It's like, this is where the rubber hits the road. And if you can actually help people to do that, oh my gosh, it's like it could be one of the most fulfilling and rewarding vocations or professions you could possibly dream of.
I think the tough part for a lot of guys, especially men, we're looked at as supposed to be providers, looked at as supposed to be someone that brings in and these things that, yes, and we know that these are the type of value that you can bring that can transform our life, but it's not one that our society really rewards much financially. Oftentimes, it seems.
Yeah, I do think that that can be problematic for men. For men, they have to demonstrate their courage or their competence or their strength or their tolerance of pain in order to enter into manhood in earnest. And I think that society and I mean not just women, but other men treat men who don't provide, who don't generate value very badly, very badly. Like that
Yeah.
gets communicated in so many different ways every day to men. It's like if you stop providing, the world is not going to care about you. Like every day people step over men on the street. Women leave men when they stop doing that. Like I've had many different relationships in my life. No woman has ever left me when I was doing well.
Let
But
me
my
ask you,
life is no man's life that I know is a constant, trajectory upward and to the right. It should trend positively, but there's ups and downs and ebbs and flows.
I'm not sure if I found your channel years ago, because you were just, of your videos, maybe, but I do know I've come back to your channel because I've seen you pop up on podcasts and other bits of media across the web. But there's a lot of channels out there, a lot of information being pushed, and it seems to paint women as the enemy. And I, as a father of 4 girls, and I've got a great wife and mother-in-law, it's like it, it's sometimes is this, yeah. What do you think about like just what seems to happen out there? I see so many guys in the comments blame and talk about women as a whole and paint them as the enemy. And I guess I just have trouble with that.
Well, sure, yeah, it's certainly problematic. The commitment that I make on my channel is to try to talk about relationships without enraging men or alienating women, because I don't think that we need more of either one of those categories. But it's hard to do. It's hard to do both of them at the same time. It's certainly much easier, both from a content creating perspective and from a marketing perspective, to like choose your side. And there's certainly content creators, both men and women, who are clearly like speaking to women and telling women what they want to hear. I made an episode about that. Telling women what they want to hear is big business. On the other hand, there are fewer content creators, and they're certainly more controversial and provocative, that have decided, I'm going to tell men what they want to hear. Is that you've been kind of passed over, you are getting the short shift in society today, and women are getting away with murder. And if you're a pretty girl, you can get anything that you want, et cetera, et cetera. There's some truth to that, but it's spoken in a way that really riles men up, and I do think that that drives clicks and views, and that there's ultimately an agenda. I made an episode about that. Making men angry is big business. So those are the two equivalents. You can either make men angry or you can tell women that they're right. And both men and women will flock to your channel and buy your product if you can cultivate that emotional experience in them. But I don't see that as an end goal. I do want to be part of a long-term solution if it's possible. And I don't see, I mean, women aren't going to go anywhere. Like they're here to stay. It's like we have to find a way to get along on some level. That doesn't necessarily mean that we just hold hands and sing kumbaya, but uh, we have to make peace with the fact that for most men, a satisfying life is going to involve women. A lot of men want to start a family, which means generally having a wife and a mother, and they might have little girls. They're going to be working with women, whether they want to work with them or not. They're going to have female coworkers. How do you navigate that? They might have a female boss. Okay. So it's like this is just the reality of the world that we're in. So how can we get along and get along in a way that's good for men and good for women, because what's good for men isn't always good for women, and what's good for women isn't always good for men. And I think that part of the reason why the content creators that speak to men have gotten so successful is because there's like no male spaces anymore, ever. Like the military used to be a space for men. No, there used to be men's clubs where they would smoke cigars. No, the business world used to. No, the Boy Scouts. No, no, that's illegal. That's discriminatory. But women have their own spaces all the time, and we don't think that there's anything wrong with women gathering in women's only spaces, and they certainly advocate for them fairly frequently. And I think with the decline of male only spaces, which I don't think is good, I think that men should have spaces where they can congregate as men, and women should have spaces where they can congregate as women. I think in the absence of male spaces, that's where you get these content creators coming in, because they're saying, I'm unabashedly for men. Like, I'm not going to kiss the ring and say, oh, women are good too, and there's nothing wrong. It's like, no, I'm pro man. And I think that's really attractive, because most guys don't have that. I remember I was invited to Rich Cooper's first ever in-person like conference this year as a speaker. And there was a number of great guests. I met Mike Piazza there. It was pretty cool. And about 100 of his members. And it was the first time I'd been in a room of that size where there was no women. There was like 120 people in a room, and they were all men. I could not remember maybe any time in my life when that has ever happened. And it wasn't like when there were no women, we were thinking, oh yeah, those broads. Yeah, I wish I could just tell my wife what's what. It's like, it was actually really focused. We didn't talk about women very often, to be honest. We were talking about fitness. We were talking about nutrition. We were talking about wealth. We were talking about like being a global citizen. And when women and relationships were brought up, it was from the agenda of like, how can I get more of, better relationships with women? How can I get that? So there wasn't anything disrespectful that was going on behind closed doors about women, but it felt so relaxed to just be in a room without women. And I missed that. And I missed that without even knowing that I was missing that, because I'd gone 40 years without experiencing that. But when I felt, it's like, wow. It's almost like when I grew up in Las Vegas in the desert. And then when I was a teenager, I moved to Seattle, which is like the total opposite of that. It's green and water. And I moved there and I was like, wow, there are places like this. And I didn't even know that it's like I needed green. I needed water because I hadn't seen it. And so sometimes we only are aware of a need when it by chance gets fulfilled, and then it gets awoken. And it's something that we have to put on our radar moving forward. So that's what I kind of think about that.
I like that. Used to have a conference called Menfluential, ran it for about 6 years. And as the name implies, it was pretty much, we had about, I think, 500 guys. It wasn't, we didn't exclude women. It was actually, but men in the men's lifestyle space. Yeah, we shut it down right before COVID. It was like a party. And that's probably why it was successful, because we ran it like a party. It was just a fun, but everything you said, exactly. We weren't there to bash women. We simply wanted to talk just deeper about guys. There's something in a room, you can talk about erectile dysfunction or the issues you're facing maybe in your 40s or 50s, and you don't feel embarrassed about that in a group of guys. And that's, yeah.
In my experience, it's a totally different way of communicating. So when I do sessions with men, they're often very different from the sessions I do with women. I have to use, in general, far more language with women than with men. Like, things need to be couched. They need to be qualified. There needs to be preparation. Sometimes you have to start soft and then escalate depending on whether the message has been received. With men, I can't count the number of times where I meet a new guy and he walks into the room and he's like, don't hurt my feelings. Like, tell me the truth. Give it to me straight, doc. Like, I can take it. I don't want bullshit. And it's like, I can just be brutally honest. I can be very direct. I can cut to the chase. I really enjoy that. Like, it takes more effort for me to communicate in that feminine style. I can do it, but I love being able to communicate directly and honestly. So, and I think that's one of the things that changes when you have all male environments is that you can allow masculine communication to dominate.
I've seen the word, and I'm sure you've seen it, toxic masculinity thrown around. I don't like this because to me, masculinity is a great thing. And to associate toxic with it, it's like then it's no longer masculinity if it's toxic. And I wish they would just use a separate word versus trying to bring down, I think, something that is, well, it's just developed a bad rap. How do you view this whole view of toxic masculinity?
Well, it's difficult. I think that if you open the door for toxic masculinity, you certainly have to open the door for the possibility of toxic femininity. And it could be that there are certain gendered expressions of behavior that do tend to dark, manipulative, or exploitative places. And this is usually around narcissistic or antisocial personalities, which can be both men and women. So I don't necessarily think that there's a problem with the term toxic masculinity per se. I think the problem is that it is way over applied. And it's almost like anything that it's usually women in that moment don't like about a man is now toxic. And just because it doesn't necessarily meet facilitate her goals or her agenda doesn't necessarily mean that it's dangerous, bad, immoral, unhealthy, etc. And a lot of the things that I've seen that have been labeled as toxic masculinity, I don't see as very toxic. As, for example, stoicism is one that comes up a lot in conversations like this. Now, there's maybe some truth to that, where I know some guys who are so practiced in emotional forbearance that they've basically cut themselves off from their own feeling apparatus. And I think that does them a disservice. It certainly seems to be the case that it's men who find it more difficult to get in contact with their emotions than women. That said, there's a difference between like being aware of your own emotions and expressing them. And there's a difference between being aware of your emotions and giving in to the emotional impulses. And it's certainly the case for successful men to holster their emotional impulses, to put on their poker face, to grit their teeth and do the thing that they need to do. Like that's very healthy. And that's associated with all kinds of positive outcomes, both for men's individual mental health and their relationships. Like a guy who's not willing to do that is going to be a very bad teammate, both for other men and for women. So I think the problem with toxic masculinity is it's just woefully misapplied and overgeneralized to any way that men are not like women. But that kind of comes from this ideological assumption that they're the same, which is one of the negative consequences of the equality situation. One definition of equality is that things are interchangeable. Like when in math we say that 1 + 2 = 3, it means that anytime we see 3 in an equation, we could substitute like 1 + 2 in parentheses, and the math checks out. Like those two things are interchangeable. And I think that people have applied that kind of logical principle of equality to men and women, and that's just not the case. It's like you can't just swap out a woman for a man and expect that there's going to be no difference, and vice versa. So the fact that men are different from women is not bad. And you have to think, well, and why are we assuming that that's the correct default, that that women's ways of feeling and acting and relating are like the right way to do things, and when men deviate from that, they're somehow toxic, or they need to become more feminine. I think that's wrong. I think that men have their ways of doing things and women have their ways of doing things, and obviously there's a lot of individual variability, and that they're both good and ideally complementary.
For the guys that are watching this and that are out there, let's say dating today, sticking within the United States, and they're dealing with frustrating viewpoints, or they're getting ghosted because maybe they're putting in their political views. Like, what advice would you give these guys that genuinely want a relationship, but they feel that things in society are pushing it so that it's making it almost hopeless?
It's tough. And, for 10 years, I lived in San Francisco, which is like the belly of the progressive politics beast. And I did encounter some of that over the course of my dating history. I call it the Lysistrata effect. I made some episodes about that. Lysistrata is this old Greek comedy about women who come together and decide to withhold sex from their husbands until the husbands stop fighting this war that they disagree with. And so they're basically withholding sexual
What did South
opportunity.
Korea call that? And then you,
Oh yeah, the
yeah,
4B thing, is that what's
yes,
going
yes,
on?
yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. And on an individual level, I've had women who broke up with me or refused to continue to see me simply because our political or ideological views differed, not because I disrespected hers, but just the sheer act that I did not agree with some of her points that had really nothing to do with our relationship um, was intolerable to certain individuals. So it's a real thing. Um, with respect to this, the advice I give, a little controversial, but think about it like this. If you're on a dating app in a major city in America, you're probably going to find uh, some women's profiles that are saying Trump supporters swipe left. If you're a conservative, if you're a Republican, if you're not a feminist, if you don't believe in X, Y, and Z, get out of here. Now, if I were talking to those women, I would say that that's probably pretty stupid in many respects, because I guarantee that that woman has a man in her life that she loves and respects that is a Trump supporter. She might not know he's a Trump supporter, but he's a Trump supporter. Do you understand? She loves and respects a guy who's a Republican or a conservative or a Christian or has XYZ belief that she says, I just can't handle that. I guarantee that she has a man, maybe it's her father, it's an uncle, it's a brother, it's a coworker, that it's like there's men in her life that hold beliefs contrary to hers that she can get along with, that she can love and she can respect. How? Because she put the person first. It's like if we're total strangers and the only thing I know about you is that you're a Trump supporter, well, now it's like that, I'm going to fill that in with all of my associations about what that's like. But if I know you for a year and then you kind of like let slip, oh yeah, I voted for Trump. It's like, oh, I might be a little surprised by that potentially, but that's just one data point among hundreds or thousands of data points. So it's shifted my perception maybe slightly, but not all that much, because hopefully after a year, I have some sort of actual living emotional connection to you. And I'm going to put that before some sort of ideological principle.
You know,
It was
that's
a great video that taught, they actually had two people from two different viewpoints work on a project together. They spent 4 or 5 hours, I think, building a table, like literally working together, where you relied on the other person. And then they would have a discussion afterwards about politics, and they were on very opposite sides. And whenever they would do this before, of course, the conversation really wouldn't go anywhere. But after they had spent a few hours depending on each other and learning more about it, they had nice conversations. And so to answer for these guys out there, yeah, is it something that they should be leading first with trying to get somebody in, or what would be the advice for the guys out there trying to build these
Well,
relationships?
what I would say is that probably politics and religion and your exes and your traumatic childhood, these are things that you really shouldn't be talking about potentially on a first date or even the first several dates.
Are you telling me that guys would actually talk about that we would sometimes maybe sabotage?
Sometimes, yeah,
Sometimes,
they
yeah.
do, and women sometimes lead with those things as well. And it's like those are just too touchy of subjects. Like they they're going to disqualify people that you might have very satisfying emotional connections with too early and for no good reason, because these things might not ever actually impact your real lives or your relationship. Now, they should be spoken on eventually, like before people get married or make long-term commitments. They should have talks about, do you want kids? What's your religion? What are your politics like? Because as I'm sure you know, with 7 kids, wow. A lot of these, it's very easy to, when you love somebody and you care about them, it's actually fairly easy to respect their differences. You can just say, yeah, I don't agree with you, but we can agree to disagree, and I respect your position. I can see some truth to it. Because it's still kind of like abstract. But when you have a kid, it's like, does it go to church or does it go to temple? Okay. Are you going to send it to the public school or like the Montessori school? Uh, you have to make decisions about the culture and the values that you impart to those children, and some of those things you can't compromise on. It's going to be sometimes it's one or the other. You can't meet
I
halfway.
100% agree. Like the first big arguments I've had with my wife were about the kids. And it was funny. It was just simply how to treat a fever. She grew up in a culture in which you don't just lower the fever. You actually do, you sweat it out. And you know, it worked really well because she did it on me. But yeah, you know, I was like, what are you like? To me, this is witchcraft. You know, she's old school. You know, she also doesn't want to just give, which I agree with. Like, let's just not give a whole bunch. You got a cold. Let's just not give you a whole bunch of drugs. There were other methods to approach this. But yeah, the first
I mean,
argument that I
Yeah,
had with my
I
wife.
think what children do is they can make a person's like thousands of dimensions of that person's family or childhood that had previously been invisible and just taken for granted visible. It's like you suddenly realize that, oh, I just thought that we always said grace before a meal because that's just what we always did. I thought everyone did that. No, we never did that in my family. That's kind of weird. Well, it's kind of weird that you don't do it. And you probably, both sides probably never thought about it at all until you have to make a decision. Are we saying grace before the meal or not? Because you can't say half a prayer. That doesn't make any sense. So part of you do have to have these talks about hot button issues. Like, what are the 5 or 6 things that lead to the arguments that most predictably lead to divorce? They have to do with sex. They have to do with kids. They have to do with money. They have to do with religion and politics, and they have to do with in-laws. And if you have very different attitudes about those 5 different things, it's going to be tricky to get along in a long-term committed relationship. So there's a time to talk about those things, but it's after the vetting period and you're like investing for a long-term relationship, not the first date. So what I would recommend to these guys is not to lie, but also not to volunteer certain information that might disqualify women who don't otherwise know them and don't have a connection with them yet.
I've always thought it good, you know, if I were to pay for my daughter's weddings, if they would ask, I would just, you know, make the one stipulation that you just need to go to marriage counseling before you get married.
It sounds good. A lot of, if you've seen my episode on that, a lot of couples counseling or marriage counseling, in my opinion, doesn't work. Maybe you mean sort of the proactive counseling where they sit down and say, what are your views on religion? What are your views on discipline?
Exactly.
Things
Like
like
go
that.
Through at least that right there.
yeah, they should have done that.
Well before they got engaged, though, to be honest. Because at that point, it's tough to break an engagement. It's tough. It's like there's caterers that are going to get paid and there's invitations that need to be rescinded. There's a lot on the line. So if you find out a really disqualifying incompatibility at that stage, there's going to be pressure and momentum to just continue on with them. It'll be easier to just keep going on some level. So I do think that I understand where you're coming from. That conversation, in my opinion, should be had earlier on in the courtship process.
I wrote my wife a letter. I was going to marry her within 2 days of meeting her. So it's been 21 years. So we'll see if it,
Yeah.
but I think it was more of, yeah, I was in a foreign country,
Which country were you in?
Ukraine. So I met over there. I had friends at the embassy in Kyiv, and they were like, yeah, it's a good time over here. It's 2000, 2001. So way before couch surfing or that kind of stuff. And, you know, it just, I could tell immediately though, it was values that like she was beautiful, drop dead gorgeous, but it was also, immediately the way I saw she was, I met her in her home. I could see the way she was with her parents, with her mom, with her dad, the way I was treated as a guest. Those little things that at the time, like I'm not like keeping score here. Things like that when maybe you've been with people that would like just knock it out of the way. And yeah, it's funny as a guy, you know, what we're looking for.
They wanted to test out how well people knew you. Like, let's say you were the subject, Antonio. And so they would give you a bunch of tests to see how you kind of viewed yourself, et cetera. And they would give those same measures to your friends, like 10 of your friends. Say, okay, Antonio has this much courage and this much intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. And kind of averaged up how all of your friends saw you. Then they invited like 10 strangers into your room when you weren't around. And those strangers just spent 15 minutes like poking around your stuff and like looking through your drawers. And then they were given the same measures. And there was no difference between what your close friends thought about you and what these total strangers thought about you from poking around in your room for 15 minutes per se. So one of the best ways to get to know somebody is to actually get in their space, to see how they live, because a lot of things start to make sense very quickly when you see how they live, and to see how they interact with their parents in particular. That's very useful because, for better or for worse, people's templates for love are imprinted on them from the primary relationship in their childhood, their family of origin, which is usually their parents. This is true whether or not the parents were functional or dysfunctional, loving or hateful. It's like that becomes the template. And even though folks might consciously with their mouth say, I would never want to be like my mom, or I wouldn't want to have the marriage that my parents did, that templating is very, very deep and unconscious. And it generally resonates in the form of attraction. And it's almost like that attraction is a recognition of familiarity. And it draws us to people who, for whatever reason, we're able to like reenact that kind of psychodynamic with in our adult lives. So, and this is regardless of whether the person is therapized and, consciously aware and intentional about how they're dating. This is just what tends to happen. So you can save yourself a lot of trouble by seeing how people live and watching them engage with their parents.
Is there a way to simplify all this? I feel like you've dedicated years and years to your knowledge base, and you're able to articulate these points very well. Um, and so somebody's going through and they're trying to become a better person. They want to become somebody that can have great relationships and live a meaningful life. Man, like this seems like even the people that dedicate their life to this study don't always seem to have this thing figured out. Are there like, are there simple blueprints out there? It's like, and I have to say that I have a lot of friends that are deeply religious, and they seem to be some of the happiest people I'm around. They've got their faith and they've got their family, and that's so. Are there shortcuts out there besides joining a cult?
Probably not, to be honest. I try to make things as simple as possible, but I have been accused of overcomplicating things. People are endlessly fascinating. I think everyone's an amateur psychologist. People want to know what other people are thinking and feeling, and they want to know how they can get the things that they want from the people around them. And that's fundamentally what psychology is about when it's applied. I think that you can kind of approach this question that you asked me, Antonio, from like, imagine if I was a physicist and you were talking to me about like explaining how the universe worked. There are different levels of comprehension. On one level, I could basically summarize it in terms of the first law of Newtonian motion. It's like, hey, man, it's very simple. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And you might think, oh, wow, that is pretty good. That explains a lot. But if you actually want to get into the nitty gritty and you start learning about relativity, and then you start learning about quantum, and then you start learning about cosmology and astrophysics, it's like, holy shit, this is really complex. And every time we answer one question, it's like two more questions pop up. It's like, yeah, that's kind of the issue. So we can talk at different levels of comprehension about people and relationships. Like one of the simplified axioms of relationships is that your best possible chance of having a good relationship and maintaining the relationship that you have is to be your partner's perceived best option. That seems fairly straightforward enough, and that actually explains a lot. But then you examine that. Well, what does that actually mean, best? Like, who judges that? Is that just totally subjective? Does everybody have their own unique metrics for evaluating that? Well, it's like yes and no. It turns out that how we evaluate partners whether it's for a long-term relationship or for a night of pleasure, some of that seems to be biologically determined. Some of that seems to be culturally influenced. And the jury is probably going to be out forever as to the exact proportion of what is what. And we continue to evolve, though albeit very slowly, and culture continues to change much more quickly. And people do have their own individual preferences that have been cultivated by their family of origins and their cultures and their temperaments, etc. So that you can spend a lifetime just examining that. But then it's like, well, what about perceived best option? Sometimes people think that an option is better than it is, or that an option that could be very good isn't worth their time. It's like, oh, perception. How do people actually form cognitive models about their world? Fuck, that's another like lifelong study right there. So everything can be kind of like knowledge is fractal. No matter how far you zoom into a fractal, there's more fractal. And so if you did that for a long time, you even lose a sense of scale. You actually don't know where you're at. So the highest truth seems to be true on as many different levels of comprehension simultaneously. But that's actually very, very difficult to do. And it generally means that truth is so broad that it almost borders on the idiotic, which is why the highest truth often seems so simplistic and is often ignored. Like one of my favorite wisdom books is the Tao Te Ching, which I've read, I don't know, at least 100 times. And it starts with the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. It's like, yeah, that seems straightforward enough. That seems like something that even a 5-year-old could say. But it has enormous ramifications across multiple levels of comprehension, from the very simple to the highly complex. And it took a sage, 80 years to be able to say that with confidence. So that's kind of what I got for you on this. Like it can be simplified to an extent, but the more that you want to prioritize the truth and reality, the more complex it becomes.
I love that you gave me a great book recommendation that you've read 100 times. That I will take and have to go grab.
That book is great.
Looking at your book, this was your third book, right? You put out The Value of Others, correct?
That's right.
Do you feel it's having the impact you wanted? Obviously, when we create things, whether it's a video, a book, like you throw it out to the world, is it making a difference or the difference that you wanted to make?
I think so. I'm very proud of that book. I'm very happy with the way it turned out. I've reread chapters from time to time, and I'm like, wow, this still sounds really good. Like I agree with this. It came out pretty well. Like I'm happy with the outcome in terms of the creation of the actual text. And it's had a bigger reception than I could have hoped for. Like, I think it's already sold over 50,000 copies in 6 months, which doesn't sound like a lot in comparison with social media numbers where they're measured in the millions. But that's enough to be in the top 10 of certain Amazon categories worldwide. And this is without spending a single dollar on paid advertising or having a publisher or having an agent or having a marketing team. Like it's just me. And I told some people about it, and I was able to just put it out on a e-commerce platform, and thousands of people buy it. It's incredible. And the response I've gotten has generally been extremely positive. Like I would say 98% very positive. People often say that they wish that they had read that book 20 years ago. And it is a bit more complex than the content on the YouTube because it's a different medium. Like what works on YouTube doesn't work on a book, and what works in a book doesn't work on YouTube. And the point of a book is, I think, to be considered and read and reread, maybe not in one sitting, and ideally to stand the test of time. Nobody cares about what you put out on YouTube a week ago, but a book could be relevant for hundreds of years. So it's a very different intention behind the creative process. And when I wrote that book, I kind of wanted it, if possible, to be a definitive perspective on relationships that would still be relevant a century from now. It wasn't just to like capitalize and make a quick buck. There's much easier ways to do that. So I'm really happy and satisfied with the way it turned out and the response thus far. And I'm interested in writing another one. I can't wait to start again.
So you haven't started on the next one. That was going to be my next question. Do you already have it kind of laid out what you're going to do next?
You know, I tried. I tried in the fall of last year to kind of write a follow-up book to that, speaking primarily on the way of the captain, which is a metaphor that I use in the book. And I didn't like how it was coming out. So I realized that instead of forcing it, maybe I needed some of those ideas to cultivate and germinate a bit longer inside of my mind. So I paused that. I have another idea that I'm going to try next month when I'm away on a writing retreat, and we'll see if that one comes out any better. What I've discovered is that it's a good idea not to force things, and that when things are ready to be born, they're much more painlessly delivered. But I'd love to get you a copy, man. I don't know if I've actually sent you a copy, but I'd be happy to mail one out to you.
Yeah, I want to get a signed one.
Of course.
And courage. You said courage is one of your core values. So
Yeah, yeah. I certainly want it to be more and more. I think I chose that because I think I was a more timid person when I was younger, and I didn't like that about myself, and I wanted to consciously cultivate greater courage. So I had to do things that scared me. So now I have, a couple decades of confronting my fears and doing things that maybe,
it sounds like you got a couple decades of proof that you're courageous.
yeah, I mean, I could always be more. The thing about values is they're infinitely receding, right? Um, and oftentimes those who have them are shielded from the knowledge of their own possession. Like, for example, it's not so humble to be aware of your own humility, right? So sometimes the most humble people don't even know that they're humble.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a protection for them against falling into a potential trap of vanity, which lurks on the side of every virtue.
Was it old Socrates? He was the Oracle of Delphi. Talked about he's the wisest man because he doesn't view himself as.
He knows that he knows nothing, I think is what
Yes.
they said. And the oracle above, of course, has know thyself as the above the archway. So ultimately, I think that's what they're connecting, is that uh, the future is more or less laid clear if you understand who you are. Sun Tzu said this in The Art of War. If you know yourself and you know your enemy, you will win 100 battles out of 100. If you perfectly know yourself and you perfectly know your enemy, you will never get into a battle that you can lose, and you will never get into a battle that you won't win. But you have to really know yourself, and you have to really know your enemy.
You can't let your ego get in the way. Sometimes I have trouble with that. You think you're smart. Oh, I've got this figured out. And then
It'd be hard. I mean, if I won 99 battles in a row, I'd probably be the most famous general of all time. And that'd be difficult to see clearly without, and not through the lens of my reputation and my previous success. But on some level, that's what war demands, is you have to start from scratch every single time. And I mean, America's learned that the hard way in recent decades. They tried to use old, tactics that worked in previous conflicts, and they didn't realize they were fighting a different type of war.
That's very, what was it? Clausewitz, war is rest. He was at war, the fog of war. And war is very simple. It's just the simple things are infinitely complex.
Yeah. Simplicity and complexity are not antithetical.
Yeah.
Simple things can't be complicated, but many simple things together can make complexity. And I think that's what we're dealing with when we talk about war or reality or the human mind.
Or life for the average guy, especially out there dating on those apps. I tell my
man.
friends nowadays, I'm like, just exit the app. Find other ways to meet people. So you can
Yeah,
actually
I
get
don't
to know
think
them.
that most guys are going to get what they want from apps. I got off the apps a long time ago.
Probably a much better place to be. But thank you, Orion. Really appreciate you being here today.
This was great. Thanks so much for inviting me on your channel. I am looking forward to learning more about fashion. And I was really impressed by the community of other creators that you've brought around yourself, and the way that you do so. I wouldn't say, let's say, altruistically, but just out of your own desire for camaraderie and growth. I think that's very impressive.
So gents, if you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments below, and don't stop watching. I got you covered here at Real Men Real Style. If you enjoyed this motivational video, I've got you covered with more. Check out this video right here. Very emotional one. I did it a while back, but still one of my better videos, and something I think is important, just that a man is able to express himself. And yeah, it's a good video. Check it out right here.